everybody. Welcome. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is McKaylee. I'm with Tattered Cover Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us as our virtual community members for this event that we have tonight and for the events that we've had for the past year that are virtual. We know that this is very atypical for bookstores. You want to be in the store smelling the books, and we're on our way there, everybody. We are on our way to being able to have in-person events hopefully soon. With the way things are going, we're very hopeful for that as well. But for now and for the past year, we want to extend our sincere gratitude to everyone who has supported us during this time and continues to support us. For those of you who might not know, Tattered Cover is a local independent bookstore located in Denver, Colorado, actually all over the Denver metro area. We have 4 stores currently, which all of them are open right now, except for our historic Lodo location, which is currently moving to McGregor Square, which is very exciting. For any of you baseball fans out there that have been watching games pretty much all day long, we are going to be in the same building as the Rockies Hall of Fame, which is really cool. So we're very excited. It's right across the street from Coors Field, and we just want to let you guys know that you can come into our other stores, Colfax, Aspen Grove, Union Station. Those are open for our regular hours, and you can come in and visit us as long as you're wearing your mask over your mouth and your nose. And you can come visit for about 90 minutes or so. But if you want to shop online, we can do that for you too. Or if you don't live in the Denver metro area, perfect. For all your bookish and gift needs, tatteredcover.com is the place for you to shop and still support local businesses. So thank you for doing that. You can also check out our robust event schedule. I know, because I'm on a lot of them and helping organize a lot of them. Robust event schedule at tatteredcover.com/event. One that you all might enjoy is next Thursday. Alec McGillis is talking about his book Fulfillment, which is about the online service industry and how we distribute books and other things. Obviously, I'm just in the book world throughout the country. So again, that is Thursday, April 8th at 6:30 p.m. Alec McGillis's new book Fulfillment. So check out that and other events at tatteredcover.com/event. I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for those who might need it. There's a black bar down at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. If you click that, you will have closed captioning should you want it or need it. And now to the event that we have tonight. This is very exciting. I've already been highly entertained by these two, but also it's going to be very informative and enjoyable. And I'm very glad that we get to host David back again, who's going to be in conversation with our author of The Hour, Alex Lazarow. He's a venture capitalist specializing in global innovation and impact. He presently works with the global investment firm Cafe Innovation. He is previously a principal with I should have asked how to pronounce this and I apologize. Omidyar Network. He's a Kaufman Fellow, Council on the Foreign Relations Term Member, and an adjunct professor at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Lazarow is a graduate of Harvard Business School and the University of Manitoba. He lives with his family in the San Francisco Bay Area. And like I said, he will be joined by Tattered Cover co-owner David Back, and we are excited to have them both, and we'll have them turn on their cameras and their microphones now. There we go. Hi, Alex. Hello.
Hello.
Yes,
and
hello.
there's David.
Here we are. Yes. So it's a great pleasure to host this event. This is actually, I believe, our first Tattered Cover sort of in-person event. We're doing this very, very safely, though. The bookstore's closed and we're on different levels. I'm in the basement. Alex is on the mezzanine. But still, it's great to be back in the bookstore. Like McKaylee said, to smell the books is great. It's also a great pleasure to have Alex Lazarow here. Alex is actually a friend of mine. We met through a book club in San Francisco. And actually several members of that book club are in the audience tonight, as well as several investors from around the world, as well as my parents. And I know at least my mom bought the book. And Alex's book is also a topic that's near and dear to my heart about entrepreneurship, venture capital, and innovation at the geographic frontiers. So not just Silicon Valley. The subtitle of his book, Out-Innovate, it's everything. It's from Delhi to Detroit, not just Silicon Valley. And so I'll quickly describe the 10 the 10 major elements that Alex's book covers. We won't have time to cover them all, but I'll at least name them. He says the things that really define the frontier entrepreneurs and make them distinct from Silicon Valley, and the things that Silicon Valley could learn from them. He has these 10 lessons: create rather than disrupt, foster the full stack, don't just rely on software, raise a camel, build for sustainability and resilience, cross-pollinate, connect ideas and networks from around the world, be born global, target the world from day one, establish a distributed team, tap talent from across the globe, build A teams, don't just hire A players, train to be a multi-mission athlete, combine impact and profit-based goals, manage risk, don't just move fast and break things, and finally, reinvent finance, develop new venture models for tougher ecosystems. So I'm afraid that we won't have time to go into all 10 of these. We'll explore a few of them. I strongly encourage you to buy Alex's book and read it, and either read it or listen to it. You can get it from tatteredcover.com, of course. It's a great book, and we won't have time to go into everything. So I really encourage people to get it and read it. So Alex, now we'll have you do most of the talking. To begin, I'd like you to share with the audience a little bit about your career background and what exactly it means to be a global VC, and what led you to write this book.
Happily. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is really great to have the opportunity to discuss the book and discuss it with you. So by day, I'm a venture capitalist. While I live in San Francisco, I invest in startups all around the world. And outside of work, as we talked about in the intro, I've been teaching entrepreneurship, and most of my students were moving back home to wherever they are, including in Denver, and or moving to emerging markets to build a startup in this new frontier. And in both those situations, I was getting frustrated because everything we know, or rather everything we think we know about startup best practices, is rooted in this time and a place, Silicon Valley and today, and for a very particular type of asset-light software-based startup. And yet, what's happening today is that the world of innovation is globalized. In 2013, you would have been right, thinking that all the action was in the Valley. There were 4 startup ecosystems in the world that had ever created a billion-dollar business. Today, 85 startup ecosystems have built a billion-dollar business. There's 480 startup ecosystems around the world. There's over 1 million venture-backed startups. The numbers have really exploded. And it isn't just that startups are getting built all over the world. Some of the world's best startups are getting built around the world. The world's biggest digital bank is in Brazil. The world's biggest edtech is in India. The world's biggest robotic process automation, imagine the automation of white collar work, repetitive tasks like taking one thing from one database to another, is from Romania. The biggest social networks in the world are from China. And so this is really what's happening. It isn't just innovation is globalizing, but the best of innovation is globalizing. And yet, what's also happening is that where it's getting built all over the world, particularly in emerging startup ecosystems and in emerging markets, context looks different. There's less capital. There's less been there, done that human capital. There are more macroeconomic shocks, and there's less infrastructure. In many markets, there isn't addresses or bank accounts or things like that we take for granted. And so the result is that what it takes to scale a startup around the world just looks different. It isn't the same in the Valley. And yet no one is telling the stories of these incredible entrepreneurs that are doing things like creating industries and having incredible social impact and doing a lot of things that we can dive into the book. And so because of my frustration in my day job, sharing lessons with the entrepreneurs I was working with or with my students, I decided to do something about it and tell the stories of these entrepreneurs. So I interviewed about 200 folks from around the world, mostly folks leading some of the biggest startups in the world, a couple hundred million, a couple billion, who have exited already. And I think taken together, what Out-Innovate does is not only tell the stories of these entrepreneurs that are challenging conventional wisdoms. I think that taken together, it tells the story of a new playbook that's emerging about how to build more meaningful and impactful businesses that I think all around the world we have an opportunity to learn from. And by the way, Silicon Valley does as well.
Yes. So I've got to say, I found your book to be more substantive than a lot of books that I've read on the subject. And I actually, as you know, I lived in Bangalore for 3 years, starting the first car rental company in India. And I've got to tell you, a lot of the things that your book says really resonate with me and my experience and the experience of people who I observed and spoke with in India. And so I do want to dive deep into some of the contexts that, some of the concepts that you elaborate in your book. One of the big ones, the first one you talk about, is creators versus disruptors. Can you explain what the difference is? And can you also explain why you might find more of one in the developing world or on the frontier than you would in Silicon Valley?
No. Well, first I'll say Silicon Valley is obsessed with the word disruption. Everything is either getting disrupted or someone is disrupting. So, where did that come from? It doesn't come from technology. It actually comes from a totally different industry, the steel mill industry, from research by a Harvard professor, Clayton Christensen, where he observed that these very big incumbent integrated steel mills weren't serving the whole market, and these little mini mills that use technological advancement to do things cheaper at the low end of the market ended up getting better and better and better, and ultimately the industry is totally revolutionized by this new technology. And that symbolism and approach and mental framework has been applied to the innovation industry. And it's this really beautiful analogy. It feels like this modern day David and Goliath of the small player being able to really conquer the market. But because of that narrative, it is also, I believe, framed problem selection for entrepreneurs, where we look for an industry that is inefficiently served, and we look for a solution that's technologically based to disrupt it and do something different. And there's merit to that approach, but in many markets around the world, that isn't practical. 2 billion people are underbanked around the world. 1.5 billion don't have access to energy. The problems just look different. And so around the world, the best entrepreneurs are taking a little bit more of this creator's lens, where they are looking for problems that are currently not solved for the mass market in a formal way. They're using technology to then build a business model that does it. And by the way, have a ton of impact while doing this. Let me give you one data point. In Silicon Valley, less than 20% of unicorns are in topics like financial inclusion, fintech, healthcare, agriculture, education. In many emerging startup ecosystems, and particularly acute in the emerging startup ecosystems in emerging markets in more developing countries, the numbers are flipped. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost 70%. And so it is both a question of practicality, but also philosophical reason of why these businesses are getting built. And I'll just make one addition, which is not only these businesses look like creators, they are also imbuing the business with impact into the operational framework. As they scale, as they succeed, as they offer more financial services to their underbanked clients or healthcare or whatever, so too does their impact scale. And so it is a really great example of innovation having a direct relationship to impact. And I will say, as we go through the pandemic right now, the pandemic has not shown us any new problems. I think it's just shown a light on problems that existed. In the US, for instance, it's no surprise it's really hard to send individual aid from the government to people that don't have a bank account or are not formally banked, or to get people to go get tested if they don't have health insurance that'll pay for the tests. And so all these problems are not new, but I think that we see that these intractable issues can be addressed with new business models. And so this is a really good example of, look, we have a chance to look up and see what we can solve and where we can have impact with technology.
You use a really interesting example in your book that really illustrates how the same business, and in fact, the same company in different contexts, can be either disrupting or creating. Mm-hmm. And so you explain that, and I'd love to have you elaborate on this, but you say that Uber in San Francisco or London is a disruptor, but in Bangalore or Nairobi, it's a creator. Yeah. Can you explain the distinction? How can the same company be different things?
So I will say two things. I think one, there's the philosophy and the problem selection you take, and the second is the practicality of what happens. The way a company like Uber has scaled in the US, right, has been with this move fast and break things, not totally complying with the laws, all this kind of thing. But there's an existing taxi industry. There's an existing set of laws of what it takes to do. And in many emerging startup ecosystems, ride sharing, and by the way, Uber is one company that does this, but in Latin America, there's a local winner. In the Middle East, there's a local winner. The biggest ride sharing company in the world is in China. It's Didi. But in many of these emerging startup ecosystems, these ride sharing companies are actually formalizing an incredibly informal industry. And with that, bringing more security, bringing more formalization from a payments perspective. And by the way, complying with laws more often than not because they are creating that ecosystem. There aren't existing laws. They're helping to formalize it. And if you look at the markets,
based on my experience in emerging markets, I don't know about that.
No. In this particular, and this is very industry specific, but take your point in a lot of different ones. But if you look at the countries where Uber has been banned, they've all been in developed markets like London and other places. And if you look at the countries that have not been banned, in emerging markets have been by and large very, very successful at doing it. And I think that's a reflection of it.
Mm-hmm. So another big theme you described that I really love is you talk about unicorns versus camels. And I really dislike the term unicorn. I think it's really distorting the industry. And you offer some other variations. There might be zebras or bison, but explain what you mean. What's the difference?
Should use bison for Manitoba.
Colorado too. But
it's true.
Please explain the difference between a unicorn and a camel.
So the first version of the book did not have the camel in, but everyone talked about how Silicon Valley's language is of an animal. And so I decided, if there's zebras and cockroaches and unicorns, I should have one too. And so I tried to formalize my idea around this camel idea. So before I tell you about camels, let's talk about unicorns. Unicorns technically means $1 billion business. And it's the objective of a lot of startups. But behind that is also a philosophy on how you get there. And that philosophy of growth at all costs, where it's okay to have unsustainable unit economics in service of growth, where it's okay to have an unsustainable burn in service of growth, where it's okay to take a short-term perspective to the outcome you want to get in service of growth. In many startup ecosystems around the world, that just doesn't work. There isn't the same amount of capital. It's much harder to build the company. And you have to build on a foundation of sustainability and resilience. And that foundation is what I call building the camel. Why did I choose a camel? One, it's an animal that exists in a lot of parts of the world, and by the way, it's real. Two, it can sprint across the desert and drink water faster than almost any other animal on the planet. So when times are good, it can thrive, but it can survive in the world's harshest environments. And that's the idea with the camel. It's based on the foundation of sustainable unit economics, on managed burn, on a long-term outlook. I'll give you one example. I often think of on-demand delivery as an incredibly profligate industry. But I interviewed Mike Evans, the co-founder of Grubhub, a Chicago-based company. It took him about 10 years to IPO. And when I interviewed him, I said, hey, look, it didn't take that much venture. How do you think about it? He said, look, at every venture capital round, I was break even. And I only raised venture capital for a specific purpose, an acquisition or an expansion or what have you. I said, well, why don't you take more money and do it faster? And he said, look, I could have done it in 8 years if I'd taken some venture, 2 years less, but I would have done so at tremendously more risk. And I think that's what's happening in the Valley now, is we are missing the point. If you look at a company like Uber, you say, how did they succeed? And then you look at the methods they've done, you say, well, that worked, therefore I should do that strategy. I think what we're missing is that if you repeated that story 100 times across a bunch of different historical contexts, macroeconomic contexts, teams and CEOs, VCs that are part, whatever it is, I think that you don't get to that outcome as many times. But I think with this camel strategy, you get more repeated outcomes that are successful. It doesn't mean you don't take venture. I'm biased. I'm a venture capitalist. I think it can be an incredible tool. I just don't think it's applicable for every startup at every stage. I think it should be an option to grow, but you shouldn't be dependent on it to scale. And so that's really this notion of the camel. And I think is one of these things. If I was going to say one of the macro themes of the book is saying, look, challenge breeds opportunity. And the camel is a good example of, look, it's much harder to build a business in an emerging startup because of less capital. You succeed as a camel, you'll actually have a more long-term business that'll survive pandemics like we are now as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I think survivability is something that's a heightened concern for entrepreneurs and investors and startup employees than it probably was a year ago. Another thing, so now kind of taking this story back home to the United States or Canada, another thing you write about is the importance of immigrant entrepreneurs in both the advanced markets and in the frontier markets. Yeah. And some of the research you cite is really quite impactful about the role of, say, the so-called returning sea turtles in China, or the boomerangs in India. Yeah. People who have lived, studied, worked in the United States and Europe, and then return home to build an ecosystem and, well, build a company and build an ecosystem back home. And you also talk about, so this is actually, it's close to my heart because I was a research assistant at the Kauffman Foundation, working for John Tyler and Bob Lighton, researching the effects of immigration on entrepreneurship in the United States. And it's since, the research has expanded since then, but it's really incredible. It's like more than half of the high growth startups in the US are started by immigrants, or started or co-founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. And you explain some theories and research about what is it that is driving immigrant entrepreneurship, whether it's in Silicon Valley or Shanghai.
Yeah. First of all, I love the term returning sea turtles, which I'd never heard before. So noted on that one. But I think it is unquestionable, the power of immigrants in the world of innovation. It's just indisputable. The chapter you're talking about it's called cross-pollinators. And what I observed is when you look around the world, the best entrepreneurs or scaling the best companies tend to have this really strong cross-pollination experience of working in different contexts and different industries and then solving a problem that's close to their heart. And by the way, it isn't, there's the immigrant point, but there's actually like, if you take a step back, it actually really defies the entire Silicon Valley idea of what a successful founder looks like. A 22-year-old hoodied warrior taking down an industry with a new approach and a new attitude. When you look around the world, what you see is that it's people that are older, that have had a broad experience across different industries, that can tap different networks, and are solving a problem that they're acutely familiar with. And immigrants are the penultimate example of these cross-pollinators of taking different experiences and doing it. And to your point on the Kauffman Foundation, the research around that is a unique moment for us to look in the mirror and say, like, actually, what is our stereotype and what is real? And the numbers you quoted are absolutely right. It isn't just as CEOs and founders of the fastest growing companies, but it's also in the C-suite. And I think that in the US, a lot of our policies are not thinking directly enough about this. And a lot of countries have very successfully put in things like the startup visa program. There's famously a really big billboard with a 101 in the Bay Area saying, hey, problem with your H-1B, come to Canada. There's a really strong power around bringing a lot of folks to build businesses and bringing in talent. Silicon Valley has a little bit of this phenomenon of ready-made entrepreneurs in the sense that a lot of the most successful companies that are getting built are people that could build it anywhere, but they choose to do it in Silicon Valley or choose to do it in a lot of these places. And so I think we need to make it the choice clear and welcoming for that, or else, this will continue. We're already seeing it, right? Startup innovation can be built anywhere and very successfully at the same time. And so this, I think, is such an important lesson, looking globally, but also looking inward as well.
Yeah, it's a very important lesson because exactly as you say, innovation can happen anywhere, and it depends where the innovators are going to go. I think it's something like, I think over half the scientists on the Manhattan Project were immigrants. And you can just think, if they weren't allowed to come to the United States, maybe they went to the Soviet Union or something like that, how different the history of the world would be.
Yeah. And by the way, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please.
It isn't just about the founders. The way startups are getting built these days isn't this nucleic move to Silicon Valley, target the US market, build your team here. Around the world, best practice has been around distributed teams. I feel like these days, all I see on my Twitter feed are people showing me their remote rigs with their Zoom backgrounds and fancy cameras. But like this notion of building teams across different markets was best practice. If I was trying to build a startup in Winnipeg, my hometown, there aren't 500 CMOs that I could hire. There probably aren't 5. And if there are, they're probably employed in my competitors. So very naturally, I would build a team around the best person I get anywhere. And so this is also why it's so important to think about immigrants, but also the broad cross-pollinator. Teams are going to get built in a distributed team. And we have to think from a domestic and foreign policy of how do we build our own startup ecosystems to make that attractive as a base. Teams are getting built more and more across borders. And so this is a really big economic development opportunity for us in a lot of startup ecosystems in the Midwest, for instance, or where have you. So I think this is crucial.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought up startup ecosystems in the Midwest, because that's exactly what I wanted to talk about next, which is that I think, well, really bringing it home here, Denver, Colorado, or the Denver Boulder region, is a place that I think really was on the frontier of this kind of activity 30 years ago. And now I think it's really become a major hub in the region.
Wow.
And you quote a lot of writing and research from Brad Feld in Boulder.
Yeah.
And I want to mention another great connection. So some of these ecosystem builders, Brad Feld, Seth Levine, and Ryan McIntyre, are actually Tattered cover investors. So we really believe in them. We believe in what they've done here and their ecosystem building. And can you explain what it means to build a startup ecosystem? What are the necessary elements? What are the things that are sort of serendipitous, and how does it come together? And say, what has Brad Feld done in this region?
Well, and for that, we should give Brad a shout out. He came out with one of the books around startup communities. He just came out a sequel that I think were very formative and in the world's thinking around how to build startup ecosystems. So he should be one of your next guests around the book of his recent launch.
Seth Levine is coming up as an event here, and
that's great.
We'll get Brad here. We'll get Brad here soon. No worries.
But I will say one of the things that I write about in the book, and I really agree with Brad on, is this notion of entrepreneur centricity and that being part of it. One of the other themes that I think is really important when we think about building a startup ecosystem is policymakers and others always seem to fall in this trap of like, well, how do we get the most number of startups? This kind of top of funnel question. And I think that's a great metric and that's important to think about. But I think that we often forget about is how do we make mid-sized companies really successful? If you look at the best startup ecosystems around the world, it usually is linked to some amount of startup founders that make it to a massive exit. In so doing, themselves might make some money, but like a bunch of their executives being able to become angel investors or being trained in how to build startups and then being kind of the legion of next founders that happen. We saw that in Silicon Valley, right? Like there's the Fairchild.
Talk about the PayPal brothers. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's just this notion of I call them older siblings because what I would like to have is way more diversity in the successful entrepreneurs. It's a big problem in the Valley. It's a big problem everywhere, but one I hope will get solved. But exactly this notion of the best founders also having a role to play. I love the story of Hernan Caza from Latin America. He founded Mercado Libre today, right? Like $100 billion business, the leader of e-commerce in
right, that's the I tried to call it the Amazon of Latin America, but it turns out the Amazon of Latin America is the Amazon.
Although Mercado Libre, yeah, exactly, the Amazon is the actual Amazon. But this business model is a mix of some eBay, some e-commerce, like kind of a mix of, but they've become the dominant player of LATAM. But he's left. He started a VC fund, one of the premier VC funds of LATAM called Casite Ventures. He's on the board of a lot of the ecosystem development organizations. And so I think it's important to think about how do you scale some of these mid-sized businesses to get to that level? Because if you look at the data on some of the best startup ecosystems, what you see is, if you get one or two, nothing really happens. But once you get some type of critical mass of like 4 or 5, you see an inflection point. It happened in China where like there was one kind of first tech unicorn, and then a second, a few years later. And then at one point there was 5, and then the next year there's 20, right? It really accelerated. We're seeing the same thing play out in Europe and frankly, even in cities in the States, in particular ecosystem in the state. And so that's a dimension I think is important. And then lastly, I do think there's an important role for government, for philanthropy, for folks in building and enabling some of the ecosystem infrastructure, like the new VC funds. But we'll talk about full stack maybe later if there are questions. But like some of that infrastructure there are really big catalysts for the ecosystem. So those are just some thoughts, but we could dive deeper if there's interest.
Sure, we're going to turn to audience Q&A in just a minute. But I want to say, so a really vivid thing that you describe in this book is that in 1950, the most innovative, high-tech, wealthiest city in the world was Detroit. Now, okay, that obviously if you look at a movie, it's different than looking at a still photograph. Yeah. And I'm curious, what lessons can Silicon Valley take from Detroit in order to stay at the cutting edge of innovation? And I want to particularly say, given all the disruption that's happening because of COVID and everything that's changing all over the world, what does Silicon Valley especially have to keep in mind because of that?
I think the Detroit example is incredibly salient on this point. 100 years ago, and up until 50 years, the technology of the day wasn't software. It was automobiles. And the place you'd go do it was Detroit. There was hundreds of startups, new car companies, OEMs, what have you. The big three were there. It was the place for the automobile industry, which promised to remake how we work, how we live, how we organize our society in such fundamental ways. Exactly the same analogy as what's happening in the Valley. Fast forward, what happened, right? Today, I would argue that the capital for the sexy sports cars is in Italy, and the capital for raw engineering might be in Germany, and the cheapest cars are being made in India, and the most reliable cars in Japan. And by the way, in electrification, I think the capital is arguably California or Shenzhen. And not only did a lot of these regions around the world specialize and become the best at particular things, so did best practice come from these other regions. Think of just-in-time manufacturing, pioneer in Japan, and now best practice, not only in auto, but in manufacturing everywhere. I think the same thing is going to happen in technology, where Silicon Valley is not going to go and be irrelevant. It's still going to be an excellent place to innovate, but innovation is globalizing, and the best startups are coming from everywhere. And I believe that places like Estonia, with their e-government initiatives, will be the best around GovTech. And London pre-Brexit, I would have argued, was already the best place in the world to launch a fintech company. And different regions have become the capital for regional innovation. Singapore is becoming the dominant place to start a business for Southeast Asia, and Dubai for the Middle East. And so that's what the map is going to look like. And by the way, so will best practice come from around the world. And I think Out-Innovate is the first, but not the last, of books around startup best practice. And what's coming from around the world. And so that's why I think that analogy is prescient.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope it's the first and not the last book on the topic from you.
More work to do.
Well, thank you so much for that discussion between the two of you here. And so we want to turn it over to audience Q&A. There's a chat screen. There's a chat screen next to the screen you're watching us on at the moment, which you can type your questions into, and I'll read them off for you all. But Alex, one of the first questions we want to ask is, why a book? Why did you feel the need to write this book and put it in this format, not a video or a blog post? What was important about writing a book for you about this topic?
Well, I'm sure people wouldn't enjoy watching me on a video, so the book was my only option. But in seriousness, so I love books. I read many books every month. I love being in bookstores. I'm delighted to be here for this one. I think this is a really tough topic, and I think it takes a bunch of setup to figure it out. And then, I think it's not the kind of thing you can do in a blog or something like that. And so the book was the medium that I enjoy the most, but also one that I think allowed me to really bring the thoughts together. The book has also afforded me the opportunity to do things like this, like having an hour chat and be able to dive into parts of it that are relevant. And so I've been able to do that after and write a bunch of articles on the topic and talk about it with a bunch of folks in more specific ways. But the book for me was a catalyst to really organize my thoughts and do that. So that's the official story. Maybe I'll give you the unofficial story, which is I wasn't sure I was going to write a book. My wife, who's a much better writer than I am, had decided that she would write a fiction novel. And to keep her company, I started working on this project, which had been itching at me, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. And for fun, I submitted it to this contest called the Brackenbauer, which is named after the founders of McKinsey and the Financial Times. It's the little brother of the Book of the Year prize. And to my surprise, it was selected as one of the top 3. They flew me to New York, pre-pandemic, of course, and I met a ton of publishers and agents, and I kind of got pulled into writing the book, which had been a dream of mine, lifetime, but not maybe not something I'd started, but I felt like I'd hit on something. And so decided to write it. So that's the very official story, the unofficial story rather.
I like that unofficial story. That's really, really great. And that's also, I don't know, it's kind of inspiring to think that you never really know how that's going to land in your lap, you know what I mean? And what's going to come your way in life. But speaking of that, when you were saying like you've been forced into writing the book, where did you start research wise? Like what was your, oh, so sorry. stopped my own video. But what was your research process like? Obviously, you have a ton of experience in this. You're a professor. This is where all your ideas and a lot of your life's work has come from. But putting it into a book, where did that process start for you?
Well, I'm very lucky from a research standpoint. I've been doing venture capital for almost a decade. I meet 250 to 500 startups a year, and so had already kind of had professional relations with a lot of folks that could be part of the story. But as I observe their journeys, and I've been a board member of a bunch of companies and things like that, as I understand kind of the challenges they're having from day to day, but also kind of the macro of meeting a lot of folks, I had the instinct on what I wanted to write, and that was kind of the base of where the book proposal came from. And then as I did the research, I ended up diving in and trying to see, whether or not my assumptions were correct. I added some themes, cut back on other pieces, but that helped sharpen my thinking when I was doing the concerted effort of research. But I, just by virtue of my day job, I had a pretty strong perspective on a bunch of these issues already.
Well, wonderful. And so here's another one of, if there are people wanting to expand more and learn more about this topic, what resources other than your book do you think that they should use? Because if your book's the launch pad, where do they go from there?
So I run a monthly newsletter on Substack where I just talk about articles that are shaping the sector. So everyone's free to sign up. It's on Substack. Just Google my name. So that's one. As part of the research, I like Brad Feld's book around the community building. There's a great book by Chris Schroeder, who wrote a book about Startup Rising in Africa. There's another one that just came out called Viva Entrepreneur for LATAM. There's kind of a range of books that talk about different regions. So if you want to kind of dive into a particular region, I think there's a bunch of stuff. And in Silicon Valley, there's a great little fun movie called Something Ventured that talks a little bit about the roots of Silicon Valley that I quite enjoyed and I think is very approachable. And so that's kind of a fun one there. So those are a couple ideas.
No, absolutely. This seems kind of like a silly question. Have the two of you ever thought about doing a podcast or talking more about this on another audio medium?
Oh, well, I'd be honored. And I feel like David would be, it's kind of fun because David's been on the ground and has done this as an entrepreneur as well, which is, and as a venture capitalist, I have no discernible skills, but I can talk a lot. So I'm happy to do that. So we should talk about it.
Well, we'll talk. I think my own version of a podcast is doing book talks.
Oh, there you go.
Well, that's what we have it here for, and why part of the reason you own a bookstore now as well. So also in the same vein of research and everything, how did you get your start? David had you talk a little bit about your career, but I think another way of asking this question is like, how did you get bit by this bug? What about this subject is so fascinating to you?
I think that as you look, if you tell your story from the present looking back, everything seems very linear. But the reality, and I think for everyone's careers, is that it ends up a bunch of mix of chance opportunities and things like that. But I will say my passion, and if I hadn't been a VC, in undergrad, I thought I was going to do a PhD in economic development. I've almost done academia a couple of times in my career. So that's always been this driving force. And in some ways I'm doing venture, but I'm, writing a book and I've been teaching and things like that. So I'm kind of like, I've been pretty consistent on it. But I had an opportunity to join a VC fund. It had been really a question I've been thinking a lot about because of some of the work that I'd done before. I started my career in finance because of the advice of a professor, not go do academia right away, but get some work experience. I fell in love with the tool of finance, and this was at the time when microfinance was at zenith, where impact investing was on the rise, and I realized that a lot of the questions I was thinking about could be addressed with financial service, and that kind of put me in the direction of doing innovation investing. But kind of my true love also, in addition to investing, continues to be thinking critically about why some stuff works and why some stuff doesn't.
Thank you for that. And, your book didn't take a linear turn either. You were telling us the two different stories and, you never really knew that you were going to get there. So it's just another proof of that concept. So this is a technical question. So I'm going to read it here word for word to make sure I get everything right here. As camels require more care, feeding, and importantly, time than unicorns, are you finding more investors start to enter EM markets with patient, with patient capital approaches than in the past?
I think it's such an interesting question, and my view is it's not black and white. What's actually happening, if this whole thesis around blitzscaling, it's also a book. The authors in that one, Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye, talk a lot about where this approach of growth at all costs works, which is in a winner-takes-all market where competitors are flooded with cash and things like that. And the dynamic is that is appropriate for a narrow set of startups. There are like Airbnb is a startup that exists in that market. I think the challenge is that we take those lessons and we apply it universally to everything. And that's the problem, is that approach, I think, only works for the 1% of venture-backed startups who are themselves 1% of all startups. In many emerging startup ecosystems, I think there might be some that exist with those dynamics and might need to blitzscale. But I think for the vast majority of them, this camel approach is much more prudent. But I actually disagree with the notion that it takes more care and that. I actually think that if you build a business on the foundations of sustainability and resilience, you actually have something that's lower, like that you have more confidence will work. And let me tell you why. Every startup has a valley of death. So at the beginning, you don't make revenue and you're investing towards something. So your cash curve goes down, maybe revenue goes up. And the idea is that eventually you will pay back the investment and you'll be profitable, you'll make money. And that's ultimately what a business should do that's successful. In Silicon Valley, the notion is, well, let's jack up the revenue curve and do so by having a much deeper venture capital curve, right? A much deeper loss. What that means is that you are default dead. So if it doesn't work out, you depend on another VC round to keep you going and continue growing. You depend on it. Whereas with this camel approach, you have a lot more flexibility of saying, hey, look, when do I want to raise capital? Is now the right time? Oh my God, there's a pandemic and no one's funding. I could still survive. And so I actually believe it's to the contrary, that you actually have much more resilient businesses that require, in some ways, I don't want to say less care because every startup's very, very hard, but certainly one where you're not on the knife's edge the whole time.
David, do you have anything you want to add to that as somebody who's worked through
Well, I think I really like what Alex said at the beginning of this, is that the biggest advantage of camels versus unicorns is that camels are a lot more realistic. And there are a small number of these billion-dollar companies, but I really the camels are going to be a lot more common than unicorns.
And by the way, I actually think camels can be unicorns. We'll call them camelcorns. That's
my favorite Easter candy.
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I actually think that the unicorn is a numerical value and it's a philosophy, and the philosophies are mutually exclusive. But I actually think that there are tons of unicorns that are built with this camel approach. And so I think that's an important lens. And as a VC, I'm hoping to invest in very successful companies, but I think this foundation of strength is really critical.
Thank you for that. I feel like I'm getting the business education class I never ever got. And it's true. I find these topics so fascinating, and talking to people who know them so well, and it's just very interesting. So thank you for making this conversation engaging and worthwhile. I really appreciate it. And I know that our viewers do as well. The last question I want to ask here, David knows what I'm going to ask, but it's our last question that we ask here at Tattered Cover on our virtual events. And David, I'm going to have you start again for this time, and then we'll end with Alex as our author of the hour here. But interpret this as you will. What did this book teach you? And David, I'll let you start.
So I might end up regretting this answer, but I found this book, I find that a lot of books on this topic are either very difficult to read or are total fluff. And I found this book full of a lot of substance that was also very engaging. And so it's sort of helping me improve my own writing, to see like, oh, good, that you can have, really substantive material that still moves along and is engaging and it's fun to read.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'm a venture capitalist, so I'm perennially optimistic at all times. But as I did the interviews, I think I came out with hope on a bunch of different dimensions. I think best practice in startup building can be one that provides us a more economically prosperous, more inclusive, and more sustainable future. And things like problem selection around being a creator and really thinking about the industries you want to build, building it with more sustainability in mind. Realize, as borders are seemingly coming up around the world, the importance of cross-pollination and globalization as part of the movement. And the philosophical approach of having impact built in the business and that not being mutually exclusive. We're building incredible businesses. Give me hope. I don't think entrepreneurship is a panacea for all of the problems, but I actually think it's an incredible vector to solve some of these intractable problems in partnership, in concert with other players in the economy. And I think that's the bit that we're seeing it in emerging ecosystems. But I think that as we come out of the pandemic, my prediction is we're going to see a lot of themes have already accelerated, right? Like distributed themes that I've talked about. I think these critical ones are going to continue becoming more important. So that's my hope, but also I think what I learned coming out of it as well.
Well, and I think we all could use a little bit of hope right now in a variety of different avenues. So it's wonderful that you were able to get that from the interviews. And I'm sure that people who read and buy Out-Innovate will get some of that as well. So as once again, we encourage you to do that at tatteredcover.com. Alex, I want to give you a moment to remind people who you are, where they can find you, and anything else that you want to say before we end this evening.
Well, that's so nice. Alex Lazarow, you can find me on Twitter at Alex Lazarow, on LinkedIn at Alex Lazarow, on Substack. For my newsletter, if you're interested, searching my name as well. I'm just really delighted to have the opportunity to have the conversation. This was a lot of fun, and I'm really also I think in this moment it's so important to support local bookstores and small businesses, and so really excited to be part of that conversation too.
Thanks so much for coming into the bookstore, and thanks so much for this very interesting conversation. And again, I highly encourage people to get Alex's book, Out-Innovate, at tatteredcover.com.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you again, everybody. We really appreciate you being here. Both of you, if you'll stick around while I just close this out here tonight. Once again, this is Tattered Cover Bookstore with Alex Lazarow and his new book, Out-Innovate. Thank you guys again for joining us. Stay safe, everybody. Happy reading. Bye, all. And we're out.
Cool.